You think winter is hard? You complain when your heating bill goes up. You shiver when the temperature drops to freezing. But imagine this: no walls, no furnace, no grocery store, just you, animal skins, and cold so brutal it could kill you in minutes. This was winter for our ancestors 20,000 years ago, when the world was locked in ice, when glaciers covered half the planet, when temperatures plunged to minus 50 degrees and stayed there for months. Yet they didn't just survive, they thrived. While you're wrapped in blankets, cranking up the thermostat, complaining about a little snow, they were building architectural marvels from mammoth bones, creating technologies we're still trying to understand, developing social systems so advanced they put modern communities to shame. These weren't desperate people barely clinging to life. They were innovators, artists, master engineers. They took the harshest conditions Earth has ever thrown at humanity and turned them into opportunities. They used winter, brutal, killing winter, as their workshop, their university, their laboratory. What they discovered during those frozen months would change human history forever. The technologies they perfected, the social bonds they forged, the psychological resilience they built, all of it emerged from conditions that would destroy most of us today. You want to know what humans are truly capable of? Forget everything you think you know about cavemen. This isn't about surviving winter. This is about conquering it. And what they accomplished will change how you see human potential forever. Close your eyes. Picture Earth, but not the Earth you know. Not the green valleys and flowing rivers. Not the forests thick with life or the oceans that sparkle under warm sunshine. Picture a world where ice rules everything. 20,000 years ago, our planet was a stranger to itself. Glaciers stretched like frozen oceans across entire continents. Ice sheets 2 miles thick crushed the land beneath their weight. Where New York City stands today, buried under more ice than you could climb in a lifetime. Where London bustles with millions of people, a wasteland of howling wind and endless snow. This was the Pleistocene epoch, the Ice Age. And it wasn't just cold. It was apocalyptically, impossibly, kill you in minutes cold. Imagine stepping outside and feeling air so sharp it cuts your lungs with every breath. Imagine wind that doesn't just chill you. It strips the warmth from your body like a thief stealing everything you have. Imagine snow that doesn't melt, ever, layer after layer, year after year, until the world disappears beneath a white shroud of death. Most of Northern Europe, gone, vanished under ice. Most of North America, a frozen tomb stretching from coast to coast. Asia, locked in winter that lasted not months but millennia. The few patches of land that remained ice-free were harsh, unforgiving tundra, where temperatures regularly plunged to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there for half the year. This was a world where survival seemed impossible, where the very air could freeze the moisture in your eyes, where exposed skin would turn black and die in minutes, where finding food meant competing with woolly mammoths, cave bears, and saber-toothed cats that were perfectly adapted to conditions that should have wiped humanity off the face of the earth. And yet, in this frozen hellscape, something extraordinary happened. Our ancestors didn't just survive. They didn't just huddle in caves waiting for better times. They didn't just barely cling to life while ice ruled the world around them. They thrived. While glaciers carved valleys and reshaped continents, human communities were building. While blizzards howled across the frozen landscape, they were innovating. While the world seemed locked in eternal winter, they were creating technologies, developing cultures, and forging bonds that would echo through human history for thousands of years. These weren't the brutish, barely human cavemen you might picture from movies. These were sophisticated people with complex societies, advanced technologies, and problem-solving abilities that would impress engineers today. They looked out at a world that seemed designed to kill them, and they saw opportunity. They faced conditions that would break most modern communities in days, and they turned those conditions into their greatest advantage. But how? How does a species with no fur, no natural weapons, no built-in protection against the cold, not only survive but prosper in conditions that would challenge a polar bear? The answer lies in something our ancestors possessed that most wild animals didn't. Something that would prove more powerful than claws, or thick fur, or layers of blubber. Something that would allow them to not just adapt to the Ice Age, but to master it. They had each other, and they had something else. Something that would transform them from another struggling species into the dominant force on a frozen planet. They had the ability to learn, to innovate, to build on the knowledge of those who came before them. Most importantly, they had the wisdom to understand that in a world where individual survival was impossible, community survival was everything. The archaeological evidence tells us a story that sounds almost mythical. Across the frozen landscapes of Europe and Asia, small groups of humans were building permanent settlements, not temporary camps, not crude shelters thrown together in desperation. Permanent communities designed to last through winter after winter of conditions that would shut down modern cities. In what is now Ukraine, they built houses from mammoth bones. Not just a few bones thrown together, but carefully engineered structures using hundreds of bones arranged in precise patterns that could withstand winds strong enough to knock down trees. In what is now France, they were creating cave paintings that required sophisticated planning, advanced pigment-making technology, and the kind of artistic vision that takes years to develop. In what is now Germany, they were crafting tools so precisely made that archaeologists initially thought they must have been created with metal technology. And they were doing all of this during winter months when simply staying alive should have consumed all their time and energy. The more archaeologists dig, the more incredible the picture becomes. These communities weren't just surviving Ice Age winters. They were using those winters as workshops, as universities, as laboratories where they developed the technologies and social systems that would eventually become the foundation of human civilization. They figured out how to read weather patterns weeks in advance using nothing but their observation of wind, clouds, and animal behavior. They developed food preservation techniques so advanced that some modern food scientists are still trying to understand how they worked. They created heating systems for their homes that were more efficient than most modern wood stoves. But perhaps most remarkably, they developed social systems that allowed dozens of people to live together in close quarters for months at a time without tearing each other apart. They created ways of making decisions, resolving conflicts, and maintaining morale that kept communities functioning smoothly, even when the stress of survival should have driven them crazy. These weren't accidents. These weren't lucky discoveries made by a few exceptional individuals. This was systematic innovation carried out by entire communities working together toward a common goal. Not just surviving winter, but using winter as an opportunity to become something more than they had been before. And the evidence suggests they succeeded beyond anything we might have imagined possible. While the Earth was locked in ice, while most life forms were simply enduring until conditions improved, our ancestors were building. They were growing. They were laying the groundwork for agriculture, for cities, for writing, for all the technologies and cultural achievements that would define human civilization for thousands of years to come. But they had a secret weapon nobody expected, something that made the difference between communities that barely survived and communities that flourished even in the harshest conditions imaginable. Something that transformed desperate people into master engineers, brilliant artists, and social innovators whose achievements still amaze us today. That secret wasn't what they built. It was how they built it together. You've seen houses made of wood, brick, steel, and concrete. But have you ever seen a house made of death? In the frozen steppes of Eastern Europe, 20,000 years ago, our ancestors were building homes from the skeletons of giants. Not crude huts, not desperate shelters thrown together from whatever they could find. Architectural marvels that would make modern engineers stop and stare in amazement. Picture this. You're walking across a windswept plain where the temperature hasn't risen above freezing in months. The ground is hard as concrete, covered in snow that crunches under your feet like broken glass. In the distance, you see something that doesn't belong, something too regular, too purposeful to be natural. As you get closer, the shape becomes clear. It's a house. But unlike any house you've ever seen, the walls are made of skulls, massive woolly mammoth skulls, each one larger than a modern refrigerator, arranged in perfect rows like giant white bricks. Between the skulls, smaller bones fill every gap, jawbones, leg bones, ribs, fitted together with the precision of a master stonemason. The whole structure is covered in carefully prepared animal hides that have been stitched together to create a waterproof, windproof shell. This isn't the home of some desperate family barely clinging to survival. This is sophisticated architecture built by people who understood engineering principles that wouldn't be formally discovered for thousands of years. At Mezhyrich, in what is now Ukraine, archaeologists have uncovered not just one of these mammoth bone houses, but an entire village. Each house used the bones of approximately 30 mammoths. That's roughly 15 tons of bone per structure, all carefully selected, prepared, and positioned to create buildings that could withstand hurricane-force winds and temperatures that would freeze your breath solid. The engineering is breathtaking. The mammoth skulls weren't just stacked randomly. They were arranged so that the natural curves and ridges interlocked, creating walls that became stronger under pressure. The foundation used the heaviest bones, massive leg bones and pelvic girdles, arranged to distribute weight evenly across the frozen ground. The roof structure was created from the longest, straightest tusks, curved and positioned to shed snow and channel wind over the building rather than against it. But the real genius was in the details. Between the large bones, smaller bones were wedged and fitted to eliminate drafts, not just stuffed in randomly, but carefully selected for size and shape to create perfect seals. The gaps were then packed with a mixture of smaller bone fragments, moss, and animal hair that created insulation more effective than many modern materials. The floors weren't just frozen ground. They were constructed platforms made from flat bones arranged like tiles, creating a raised surface that kept the inhabitants off the frozen earth. Underneath this floor, the builders had created air gaps that served as insulation, preventing ground frost from penetrating into the living space. And the doorways, these weren't simple openings. They were sophisticated airlocks designed to prevent heat loss. A series of hanging animal hide curtains created multiple barriers against cold air. Some structures even had what we might recognize as mudrooms, small entry chambers where outer clothing could be removed before entering the main living area. But building the shelter was just the beginning. The real challenge was staying warm inside it. The heating system these communities developed was a masterpiece of thermal engineering that put most modern wood stoves to shame. At the center of each structure was a carefully designed fire pit that wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was a precisely engineered combustion chamber with intake vents that controlled airflow and exhaust systems that channeled smoke without filling the living space. The fire itself was fed through a sophisticated system of fuel management. They didn't just burn whatever wood they could find. They used a carefully planned combination of materials that burned at different rates and temperatures to maintain consistent heat throughout the day and night. Animal fat served as their primary fuel source, but not just any fat thrown onto a fire. They rendered fat into specific forms, some that burned hot and fast for cooking, others that burned slow and steady for overnight heating. Bones were selected and prepared as fuel, with different types of bones burning at different temperatures and for different lengths of time. They even used dried dung as fuel, but again, not randomly. Different animals produced dung with different burning characteristics. Mammoth dung burned slowly and produced steady heat. Horse dung burned hotter, but faster. They mixed these materials in precise proportions to create fuel blends that would burn consistently for hours without attention. The heat distribution system was equally sophisticated. Rather than just hoping warm air would circulate naturally, they designed their living spaces with thermal zones. The area immediately around the fire was kept hottest for cooking and tool work. Sleeping areas were positioned to receive steady, moderate heat. Storage areas were kept cooler to preserve food and materials. They even developed a system of heat storage that allowed them to maintain warmth long after the fire died down. Large stones would be heated in the fire during the day, then moved to sleeping areas at night, where they would continue radiating heat for hours. Different types of stone held heat for different lengths of time, so they could customize their heating system based on the specific needs of each night. But perhaps most impressive was their understanding of air circulation. These weren't stuffy, smoke-filled caves. They had figured out how to create airflow systems that brought in fresh air, circulated warm air throughout the living space, and exhausted stale air and smoke without losing heat. Some structures even had what we might recognize as primitive chimneys, bone and hide constructions that created updrafts to pull smoke out of the living area. The result was homes that maintained comfortable living temperatures even when the outside air was cold enough to kill an unprotected human in minutes. Archaeological evidence suggests these structures could maintain interior temperatures in the 60s and 70s Fahrenheit, even when outside temperatures dropped to -40. And they weren't small, cramped spaces where people just huddled together waiting for spring. These were complex, multi-room buildings with designated areas for different activities. Sleeping areas, cooking areas, tool-making workshops, food storage rooms, and even what appeared to be communal gathering spaces for group activities. The tools and artifacts found in these structures tell the story of communities that weren't just surviving winter, but using winter as their most productive time. Evidence of sophisticated tool making, textile production, food preparation, and even artistic creation. These homes weren't shelters from winter. They were workshops where winter's challenges became opportunities for innovation and advancement. But the most remarkable thing about these mammoth bone mansions wasn't their engineering sophistication or their thermal efficiency, or even their durability. It was what they represented about the communities that built them. Building one of these structures required the coordinated effort of dozens of people working together for weeks. The mammoth bones had to be collected, which meant either hunting mammoth, one of the most dangerous activities imaginable, or finding and transporting bones from animals that had died naturally. Either way, it required teams of people working together with incredible coordination and cooperation. The bones then had to be prepared, cleaned, shaped, fitted together through careful planning and precise execution. The hides had to be hunted, skinned, preserved, and sewn together using tools and techniques that represented generations of accumulated knowledge. Most importantly, the entire community had to commit to staying in one place for the long term. These weren't temporary shelters that could be abandoned if conditions changed. These were permanent settlements that represented a community's decision to not just survive in one location, but to thrive there year after year. But building the shelter was just the beginning. Because once you've invested that much effort into creating a home, you have to figure out how to live in it for months at a time without driving each other completely insane. And that's where our ancestors faced their greatest challenge yet. Fire is life. Fire is death. Fire is the thin line between survival and oblivion in a world made of ice. You flip a switch and your house warms up. You turn a dial and heat flows exactly where you want it. You take warmth for granted because you've never faced a night where losing your fire means losing your life. Our Ice Age ancestors lived with that reality every single day. For them, fire wasn't convenience. It was the difference between waking up tomorrow and never waking up again. And so, they became masters of something we've almost forgotten: the art of making firework miracles. In your modern home, you might have a furnace in the basement, electric heaters in the rooms, maybe a fireplace for atmosphere. Ice Age communities had one fire pit, one source of heat for cooking, warmth, light, protection, and survival. And they made that single fire do things that would amaze modern heating engineers. They didn't just build big fires and hope for the best. They created thermal management systems so sophisticated that some contemporary architects are studying them to improve modern building design. The fire pit itself was precision engineering. Not a simple hole in the ground, but a carefully constructed combustion chamber designed to maximize heat output while minimizing fuel consumption. The shape mattered. Too shallow, and heat would dissipate too quickly. Too deep, and airflow would be restricted, leading to smoky, inefficient burning. They created intake systems that controlled how much air reached the fire, allowing them to regulate temperature with the precision of a modern thermostat. Channels carved into the frozen ground that could be opened or covered to increase or decrease the fire's intensity. Some structures even had multiple air intake points that could be adjusted independently to create different heat zones within the same fire. But the real genius was in their fuel management. They didn't burn whatever they could find. They created fuel systems that were more sophisticated than most modern wood stoves. Animal fat was their primary heating fuel, but they didn't just throw fat onto the fire. They developed rendering processes that created different types of fat for different purposes. Some fat was processed to burn hot and fast for cooking. Other fat was prepared to burn slowly and steadily for overnight heating. They even created fat-based candles and torches that could provide light without consuming their precious heating fuel. Bone became another crucial fuel source, but not random bones thrown onto a fire. They understood that different bones burned differently. Large leg bones burned slowly and produced steady heat for hours. Smaller bones burned hotter but faster, perfect for cooking or quickly warming up a cold space. Antlers burned with a different characteristic than other bones, producing intense heat that was perfect for metalworking or tool making. They developed processes for preparing bones as fuel. Bones were dried in specific ways to reduce moisture content and increase burning efficiency. Some bones were cracked or split to expose the marrow, which burned like natural kindling. Others were left whole to provide long-burning fuel that could maintain heat through the night. Even dung became precision fuel in their hands. But they didn't just gather whatever animal waste they could find. They understood that different animals produced dung with vastly different burning characteristics. Mammoth dung burned slowly and steadily, perfect for maintaining overnight heat. It produced minimal smoke and created a consistent, moderate temperature that was ideal for sleeping areas. Horse dung burned hotter and faster, excellent for cooking or rapidly heating work areas. Bison dung fell somewhere in between, providing good general-purpose fuel that could be mixed with other materials to create custom fuel blends. They even learned to prepare dung for optimal burning. Fresh dung was composted and aged to reduce moisture and concentrate combustible materials. Some dung was mixed with dried grasses or animal hair to create fuel blocks that burned more efficiently than either material alone. The result was fuel management systems that could maintain fire continuously for weeks or even months. Archaeological evidence from some sites suggests that community fires burned continuously throughout entire winter seasons, never being allowed to die completely. But maintaining the fire was only half the battle. The other half was distributing that heat throughout the living space in ways that kept everyone comfortable without wasting precious fuel. They created thermal zone systems that would make modern HVAC engineers jealous. The central fire area was kept hottest for cooking and tool work. Around this, they arranged sleeping areas that received steady, moderate heat. Storage areas were positioned to stay cooler, preserving food and materials. Work areas could be heated more or less depending on the activity taking place there. They achieved this through careful manipulation of airflow and heat circulation. Barriers made from hides or constructed from bones could be positioned to direct warm air toward specific areas. Openings in walls or floors could be covered or uncovered to control how heat moved through the space. Some structures even had what we might recognize as primitive ductwork, channels constructed from bones or carved into the ground that allowed warm air to be directed to specific areas of the building. Hot air from the fire could be channeled under sleeping areas, providing radiant heating that kept people warm without requiring them to sleep right next to the fire. But perhaps their most ingenious innovation was their heat storage systems. They figured out how to capture heat during the day and release it slowly throughout the night, creating 24-hour warmth from fires that might only be actively fed for a few hours. Rocks were their batteries, but not just any rocks thrown near the fire. They selected specific types of stone that had the right heat retention characteristics. Some stones absorbed heat quickly, but released it fast, perfect for rapid heating when people came in from the cold. Other stones absorbed heat slowly, but held it for hours, ideal for overnight warming. They developed heating protocols that would make modern engineers proud. Stones would be rotated in and out of the fire according to carefully timed schedules. Hot stones would be moved to sleeping areas, wrapped in hides to prevent burns while allowing heat to radiate slowly throughout the night. As stones cooled, they would be returned to the fire and replaced with freshly heated ones. Different sizes of stones served different purposes. Large stones provided steady, long-lasting heat for sleeping areas. Smaller stones could be heated quickly for personal warming or placed in cooking pits to provide consistent cooking temperatures. Flat stones could be heated and used like warming plates to keep food hot during meals. Some communities even developed portable heating systems. Heated stones would be placed in hide containers that could be carried during hunting trips or moved to different areas of the settlement as needed. It was like having a prehistoric heating pad that could provide warmth for hours after being removed from the fire. The psychological impact of their mastery over fire can't be overstated. In a world where darkness lasted for months and cold could kill in minutes, fire represented more than just warmth. It was light in endless night. It was protection from predators. It was the heart of community life around which everything else revolved. But fire was also dangerous. One mistake, one moment of carelessness, and the fire that meant survival could become the force that destroyed everything. Houses built from animal hides and bone were incredibly flammable. A single spark in the wrong place could burn down months of work and leave a community homeless in killing cold. So they developed fire safety systems that were remarkably sophisticated. Fire pits were surrounded by stone barriers that prevented sparks from escaping. Areas around fires were kept clear of flammable materials. They even had what we might recognize as fire suppression systems, containers of sand, snow, or water positioned strategically around fire areas that could be used to quickly extinguish accidental fires. Most importantly, they never left fires unattended. Community members took shifts monitoring fires throughout the day and night, ensuring that fuel was added when needed, that fires didn't burn too hot or too cold, and that no sparks escaped to threaten the settlement. This constant fire tending became one of the most important social activities in Ice Age communities. It wasn't just a chore. It was a responsibility that required knowledge, skill, and absolute reliability. The person tending the fire held the survival of the entire community in their hands. But staying warm was only half the battle. Because once you've solved the problem of not freezing to death, you face an even greater challenge: maintaining your sanity during months of darkness, isolation, and stress that would break most modern people in days. And that's where our ancestors discovered something about human psychology that we're still trying to understand today. Imagine the sun disappearing, not for a day or a week, but for months. Imagine darkness so complete, so endless, that you begin to forget what light looks like. Imagine cold so deep that it seeps not just into your bones, but into your soul. This was the psychological battleground where Ice Age communities either thrived or died. You complain about cabin fever after a weekend indoors. You get restless after a few days of bad weather. You feel depressed when winter drags on too long. Now multiply that by 100, and you begin to understand what our ancestors faced during Ice Age winters. But here's what's remarkable. They didn't just survive the psychological challenges of endless darkness and isolation. They turned those challenges into opportunities for cultural development that would define human civilization for thousands of years. When the sun barely rises for weeks at a time, when the world outside is a howling wasteland of wind and snow, when you're trapped in close quarters with the same people month after month, the human mind faces pressures that most of us can't even imagine. Modern psychological research tells us what happens to people under these conditions. Depression sets in, anxiety skyrockets, interpersonal conflicts escalate, decision-making abilities deteriorate. Some people become withdrawn and listless, others become irritable and aggressive. In extreme cases, people can experience complete psychological breakdown. Our ancestors had no understanding of modern psychology. They knew nothing about seasonal affective disorder, cabin fever, or stress management techniques. They didn't have medications or therapeutic interventions or mental health professionals. What they had was something more powerful. 20,000 years of trial and error that had taught them exactly what the human mind needed to not just survive isolation and darkness, but to flourish in conditions that would challenge modern mental health experts. They understood something we're only beginning to rediscover: that the human mind, like the human body, needs specific things to stay healthy. And when those things aren't available naturally, they must be created artificially. The mind needs stimulation, so they created complexity. The tools they made during long winter months weren't just functional, they were intricate works of art that required intense concentration and skill to create. Bone needles so fine that making them required steady hands and perfect focus for hours at a time. Carved figurines with details so precise that modern artists struggle to replicate them. This wasn't just busy work to pass time. This was deliberate cognitive exercise designed to keep minds sharp and engaged when the outside world offered no mental stimulation. Archaeological sites from Ice Age winters are filled with evidence of sophisticated craftwork, tool-making, and artistic creation that required the kind of sustained mental effort that keeps brains healthy. The mind needs variety, so they created rotation systems. No one person was responsible for the same task day after day. Hunting, cooking, fire tending, tool making, childcare, storytelling. All of these responsibilities were shared and rotated among community members. This ensured that everyone stayed mentally engaged with different types of challenges and prevented the mind-numbing boredom that can lead to psychological breakdown. The mind needs purpose, so they created meaning. Winter wasn't just something to endure. It was the most important time of the year for cultural development. This was when knowledge was passed from older to younger generations, when new technologies were developed and perfected, when stories were created and refined, when art was made and traditions were established. Everyone in the community had a role that mattered. Everyone had skills that were valued. Everyone had contributions that were essential to not just physical survival, but to the cultural survival of the group. This sense of purpose and meaning provided psychological armor against the despair that could easily set in during months of harsh conditions. But perhaps most importantly, they understood that the mind needs connection. Not just physical presence, but deep, meaningful relationships that provide emotional support and psychological resilience. The social structures they developed during winter months were remarkably sophisticated. These weren't just groups of people tolerating each other until spring. These were communities that used shared hardship as an opportunity to forge bonds that were stronger than anything most modern people experience. They created rituals specifically designed to strengthen social connections, not just random activities, but carefully planned ceremonies that reinforced community identity and individual belonging. Storytelling sessions where everyone contributed. Group meals where food was shared according to specific customs that emphasized equality and mutual support. Work activities that required cooperation and coordination. They developed communication systems that prevented the kind of misunderstandings and conflicts that could tear a community apart under stress. Methods for expressing frustration or disagreement without creating permanent divisions. Ways of resolving disputes that strengthened rather than weakened group cohesion. Most importantly, they created support systems for individuals who were struggling with the psychological pressures of winter isolation. Evidence suggests that communities had specific roles for people who might not be able to contribute to physical survival tasks, but who could provide emotional and psychological support to others. Elderly people who could no longer hunt or gather became the keepers of stories and knowledge. Children who were too young for adult responsibilities became sources of joy and hope that reminded everyone what they were working to preserve. Individuals who might be physically limited became specialists in crafts, art, or other activities that contributed to community, Morale and cultural development. The storytelling traditions they developed were particularly sophisticated. These weren't just entertaining tales to pass long nights. They were comprehensive knowledge preservation systems that served multiple psychological functions simultaneously. Stories provided escapism, mental journeys to other places and times that offered relief from the immediate pressures of winter survival. They provided education, encoding essential survival knowledge in memorable forms that could be passed down through generations. They provided social bonding, shared experiences that created common understanding and group identity. But most importantly, stories provided hope. In a world that seemed locked in eternal winter, stories reminded people that spring would come again, that hardships could be overcome, that communities could survive and thrive even in the face of impossible challenges. The archaeological evidence tells us that some of the most sophisticated art in human history was created during Ice Age winters. Cave paintings that required weeks of careful work in difficult conditions, carved figurines that demonstrate artistic skill and vision that rivals anything created today, musical instruments that show an understanding of acoustics and craftsmanship that speaks to highly developed cultural traditions. This art wasn't created despite the harsh conditions. It was created because of them. Winter provided the time, the focus, and the psychological need for cultural expression that resulted in some of humanity's greatest early achievements. They understood something we often forget, that beauty and meaning aren't luxuries that can only be afforded when times are easy. They're necessities that become even more important when times are hard. In conditions where simple survival consumed most of their physical energy, our ancestors invested their mental and emotional energy in creating beauty, meaning, and cultural richness that sustained them through the darkest months. The social psychology they developed was equally remarkable. They figured out how to manage group dynamics under extreme stress in ways that prevented the conflicts and breakdowns that destroy communities facing less challenging conditions. They developed leadership systems that prevented the kind of power struggles that could tear groups apart. Decision-making processes that ensured everyone felt heard and valued. Resource-sharing protocols that prevented jealousy and resentment. Conflict resolution methods that addressed problems before they could escalate into community-threatening disputes. Most importantly, they created social safety nets that ensured no individual faced the psychological challenges of winter isolation alone. Everyone had multiple relationships, multiple sources of support, multiple ways of contributing to and receiving support from the community. The result was communities that emerged from brutal winter months, not psychologically damaged by their ordeal, but strengthened by it. The bonds forged during shared hardship became the foundation for social structures that could handle whatever challenges the coming year might bring. But there was one aspect of their winter psychology that was perhaps most remarkable of all. They didn't just endure darkness and isolation, they transformed it into the engine that drove human progress forward. Because while the world was frozen, they were busy inventing the future. While you binge-watch Netflix on snow days, our ancestors were inventing technologies that wouldn't be improved upon for thousands of years. Winter wasn't downtime for Ice Age communities. It wasn't a season to wait out or endure. Winter was their most productive time, the months when innovation happened, when new tools were perfected, when technologies were developed that would reshape what it meant to be human. Think about that for a moment. Modern people often see winter as a limitation. Schools close. Businesses shut down. Activities are canceled. We retreat indoors and wait for better weather. Our ancestors saw winter as opportunity. While the outside world was locked in ice, they were building the foundations of human civilization. In the flickering light of mammoth fat lamps, by the warmth of carefully tended fires, surrounded by walls of bone and hide, Ice Age communities were running the world's first research and development laboratories. And the technologies they created were so advanced, so precisely engineered, that modern experts are still trying to figure out how they worked. Take needle making. You probably think of a needle as a simple tool, a pointed piece of metal with a hole in one end. But Ice Age needles were precision instruments that made the difference between life and death in conditions where clothing had to be absolutely perfect, or people would freeze. These needles weren't just carved from any old bone. They were crafted from specific materials: bird bones, fish bones, mammoth ivory, each chosen for particular properties. The bone had to be hard enough to penetrate thick leather, but not so hard that it would snap under pressure. It had to be smooth enough that thread wouldn't catch or tear, but textured enough that it could be gripped securely even with cold, numb fingers. Creating one needle was a process that could take days. The bone had to be selected, cleaned, shaped, and polished. The eye had to be drilled with perfect precision. Too small, and thread wouldn't pass through. Too large, and the needle would be weakened. The point had to be sharp enough to penetrate tough materials, but shaped so it wouldn't catch or tear. And they weren't making just one needle. Archaeological sites show evidence of needle production on an industrial scale. Dozens of needles in various stages of completion, suggesting that communities had specialists who dedicated significant time to creating these essential tools. But the needles were just the beginning. The thread they created was equally sophisticated. They didn't just grab whatever fiber was available. They developed complex processes for creating different types of thread for different purposes. Sinew from different animals had different characteristics. Deer sinew was flexible and strong, perfect for items that needed to stretch. Mammoth sinew was incredibly tough, ideal for heavy-duty construction. Fish bladder produced waterproof thread for outer garments. Even human hair was processed into thread for specialized applications. The preparation of these materials was chemistry without laboratories. They knew exactly how to treat different fibers to achieve specific properties. Some thread was processed to be waterproof. Other thread was treated to be extra strong. Some was prepared to be invisible when sewn, creating seamless garments that showed no stitch lines. And the clothing they created with these tools was wearable technology that was more sophisticated than most modern winter gear. They weren't just throwing animal skins over their shoulders and calling it good. They were designing multi-layer clothing systems that provided precisely controlled insulation, moisture management, and protection against wind and cold. The base layer was made from soft, thin skins that wickeded moisture away from the body. This wasn't accidental. They had figured out through trial and error which animal skins had the right properties to keep skin dry even during strenuous activity in cold conditions. Over this, they wore insulating layers made from fur-bearing animals. But the fur wasn't just left natural. It was processed and arranged to maximize insulation properties. Fur was oriented to trap warm air most effectively. Different types of fur were combined to create insulation systems that provided warmth without bulk. The outer layer was made from waterproof materials that could shed snow and ice while remaining flexible enough to allow for movement. They had developed processes for treating leather that made it completely waterproof while maintaining flexibility even in extreme cold. But they didn't just make generic winter clothes. They created specialized garments for different activities. hunting clothes that were designed for stealth and mobility, dark colors that blended with winter landscapes, minimal noise during movement, designs that allowed for quick, precise motion, work clothes that could withstand the wear and tear of tool-making and construction, reinforced in areas that experienced the most stress, designed for durability and protection during heavy labor. Ceremonial clothes that were decorated with intricate patterns and designs, garments that showed the artistic sophistication and cultural richness of communities that had moved far beyond simple survival. Even sleeping clothes that were specifically designed to maximize warmth retention during long winter nights. Designs that trapped body heat while allowing for comfort during sleep, and the footwear. Modern hiking boots have nothing on Ice Age winter boots. They created multi-layer foot protection systems that included waterproof outer shells, insulating middle layers, and moisture-wicking inner linings. Some designs even included primitive crampons made from bone or antler to provide traction on ice. Others had removable liners that could be dried and cleaned separately. The most sophisticated boots had ventilation systems that prevented moisture buildup while maintaining insulation properties. But clothing was just one aspect of their winter technology development. They also used those long winter months to perfect tool-making techniques that revolutionized how humans interacted with their environment. They developed composite tools that combined multiple materials to create implements that were stronger and more versatile than anything made from a single material. Stone points were hafted to wooden shafts using adhesives made from tree resin and animal fat. But the adhesive wasn't just slapped on randomly. They had formulas for different adhesive mixtures that provided specific properties, some that remained flexible in cold, others that created permanent bonds, some that could be heated and reformed if repairs were needed. The binding was reinforced with carefully prepared sinew that had been processed to shrink when wet, creating connections that became tighter and stronger over time. These composite tools often performed better than the sum of their parts, demonstrating an understanding of engineering principles that wouldn't be formally described for thousands of years. They created specialized tools for winter hunting that took advantage of snow and ice conditions. Ice spears designed to punch through frozen water to catch fish below. The spear points were shaped specifically to penetrate ice efficiently, and the shafts were designed to remain functional even when wet and frozen. Snowshoes that distributed weight to allow travel over deep snow. These weren't crude wooden frames with leather webbing. They were precision-engineered devices with specific shapes for different snow conditions, adjustable bindings that could accommodate different types of footwear, and repair systems that allowed for field maintenance during long hunting trips. Sleds and sledges for transporting heavy loads across frozen terrain. These weren't simple platforms dragged behind hunters. They were sophisticated transportation systems with runners shaped to minimize friction on different types of snow and ice, loading systems that distributed weight optimally, and steering mechanisms that allowed for control during transport. They even developed what we might recognize today as precision instruments, measuring devices made from bone that allowed them to create consistent proportions in tool making. These weren't rough approximations. They were standardized measurement systems that ensured tools and weapons met specific performance requirements, leveling devices that helped them construct shelters with proper drainage and structural integrity. Water management was crucial for winter survival, and these tools allowed them to ensure that melting snow and ice would flow away from living areas rather than creating dangerous flooding or ice buildup. Even early forms of compasses using magnetized iron ore to maintain direction during blizzards when visibility was zero. Getting lost during a winter hunting trip meant death, so they developed navigation tools that allowed them to find their way home, even in the worst weather conditions. But perhaps most impressively, they used winter months to develop food processing technologies that were essentially prehistoric chemistry labs. They didn't just preserve food. They transformed it into new forms that were more nutritious, more flavorful, and longer lasting than the original ingredients. This wasn't accidental discovery. This was systematic experimentation carried out over generations to develop optimal food processing techniques. They developed fermentation processes that could transform tough, fibrous plant materials into digestible, nutrient-rich foods. Different plants required different fermentation techniques, and they had figured out the specific processes for dozens of different food sources. Some fermentation created foods that were more nutritious than the original ingredients. The fermentation process actually increased vitamin content while making nutrients more bioavailable to human digestion. Other fermentation techniques created foods that could be stored for months without spoilage while maintaining their nutritional value. They created rendering techniques that could extract every possible calorie from animal carcasses. Nothing was wasted. Bones, organs, and other parts that might be discarded were transformed into high-energy foods that could sustain people through the coldest months. Bone marrow was processed into concentrated fat that provided sustained energy during long hunting trips. Organs were prepared in ways that concentrated specific nutrients while eliminating toxins that could be dangerous in large quantities. Even blood was processed into foods that provided essential nutrients that weren't available from other sources. They even figured out how to process foods to concentrate specific nutrients. They knew which organs contained which vitamins and minerals, and they developed preparation methods that maximized the nutritional value of every meal. Liver was prepared in specific ways to prevent vitamin A toxicity while still providing essential nutrients. They had figured out through trial and error the exact amounts and preparation methods that provided maximum benefit without dangerous side effects. Fish were processed differently depending on the species and the specific nutrients they contained. Some fish were prepared to maximize protein content. Others were processed to concentrate healthy fats. Some were prepared specifically for their vitamin content during months when fresh foods weren't available. And here's what's really mind-blowing. They did all of this without any understanding of modern nutritional science. They didn't know about vitamins or minerals or caloric requirements. They figured out through careful observation, experimentation, and accumulated knowledge exactly what their bodies needed to not just survive, but thrive during the harshest conditions on Earth. The archaeological evidence shows that Ice Age communities that successfully applied these food processing techniques maintained excellent health throughout winter months. Analysis of human remains from these sites shows strong bones, good dental health, and evidence of robust immune systems that could fight off the infections and diseases that killed people in less well-organized communities. But the most remarkable aspect of their winter technology development wasn't any single innovation. It was how they integrated all of these different systems into a seamless whole that made their communities not just more survivable, but more livable. The tools they perfected during winter made them more effective hunters and gatherers during the productive months. The clothing systems they developed allowed them to remain active and comfortable during weather that would immobilize people with inferior gear. The food processing techniques they mastered allowed them to maintain nutrition and health that supported both physical activity and mental acuity throughout the challenging months. Most importantly, the technologies they developed during winter months weren't just individual achievements. They were community accomplishments that required coordination, cooperation, and shared knowledge that strengthened social bonds while solving practical problems. A single needle represented not just the skill of the person who made it, but the accumulated knowledge of generations of needle makers who had perfected the techniques. A winter coat represented not just the craftsmanship of the person who sewed it, but the collective understanding of hunters who provided the materials, tanners who processed the leather, and designers who figured out the optimal construction methods. These weren't isolated inventors working alone in workshops. These were communities of specialists sharing knowledge, teaching skills, and building on each other's innovations to create technologies that no individual could have developed alone. And this collaborative innovation process was accelerating. Each winter brought new improvements, new techniques, new technologies that made the next winter more survivable and more productive. Communities that successfully applied these principles weren't just surviving Ice Age winters. They were using those winters to become progressively more capable, more sophisticated, and better equipped to handle whatever challenges the next year might bring. But there was still one piece of this winter survival puzzle that made all the difference between communities that thrived and communities that vanished into the frozen darkness. Because the most advanced technology in the world means nothing if you can't predict when you're going to need it. Food is life. But in a world locked in ice, food becomes something more powerful and more precious than life itself. Food becomes hope. Imagine opening your refrigerator and finding it empty. Now imagine that the grocery stores are closed, the restaurants are shuttered, the entire food distribution system has vanished, and winter has just begun. For Ice Age communities, this wasn't a temporary crisis. This was reality for 6 months of every year. No grocery stores, no backup food sources, no way to order takeout or call for emergency supplies. Just whatever they had managed to gather, hunt, and preserve before the world turned into a frozen wasteland. And yet they didn't just avoid starvation. They created food systems so sophisticated that communities emerged from brutal winter months healthier and better nourished than many modern people eating from fully stocked supermarkets. The key wasn't just storing food. It was engineering complete nutrition systems that could sustain entire communities through months when fresh food was essentially non-existent. And they did it using food science principles that we're still trying to fully understand today. First, they had to solve the basic math problem of winter survival. How much food does a community need to survive 6 months with no fresh supplies? How do you calculate nutritional requirements for dozens of people engaged in various activities under extreme stress? Modern nutritionists use complex formulas and detailed databases to figure out daily caloric and nutritional needs. Ice Age communities had to solve the same problems using nothing but observation, experience, and trial and error learning passed down through generations. They figured out that different people needed different amounts of food based on their age, size, activity level, and role in the community. Hunters who spent days tracking game through snow needed more calories than craftspeople working indoors. Growing children needed different nutrition than adults. Pregnant and nursing women required specialized diets that supported both their own health and their children's development. But they didn't just calculate total food needs. They understood that the type of food mattered as much as the quantity. They had identified through generations of experience which foods provided sustained energy, which foods supported immune system function, which foods prevented the diseases that could kill people during long winters of limited nutrition. And they had figured out how to preserve and store these different types of foods in ways that maintained their nutritional value for months while preventing spoilage that could doom an entire community. Meat preservation was their first priority, and they developed techniques that were far more sophisticated than simple smoking or drying. They created multi-step processes that not only preserved meat, but actually improved its nutritional value over time. Controlled freezing was their primary preservation method, but this wasn't just leaving meat outside in the cold and hoping it wouldn't spoil. They had figured out the specific conditions needed to freeze meat in ways that prevented ice crystal formation that could damage protein structure and reduce nutritional value. Different types of meat required different freezing techniques. Mammoth meat was processed differently than deer meat. Fish required different treatment than land animals. Even different cuts from the same animal needed specific handling to maintain optimal nutrition and flavor. They created storage systems that maintained consistent temperatures and humidity levels. Underground chambers carved into permanently frozen ground that stayed at exactly the right temperature to keep meat frozen without allowing it to dry out or develop freezer burn. Some of these storage systems were remarkably sophisticated. Archaeological sites show evidence of multi-chamber storage facilities with different areas maintained at different temperatures for different types of food. Meat storage areas, fat storage areas, plant food storage areas, each with environmental conditions optimized for specific preservation needs. But freezing was just one preservation method in their toolkit. They also developed smoking techniques using different types of wood and plant materials that not only preserved meat, but added nutrients and flavors that made stored food more appealing during long winter months. Different smoking materials provided different benefits. Some woods produced smoke that had antibacterial properties, helping prevent spoilage. Other materials added flavors that made preserved meat more palatable. Some smoking techniques actually increased the nutritional value of meat by concentrating proteins and adding beneficial compounds from the smoking materials. They even developed combination preservation techniques that used multiple methods simultaneously to create foods that were more nutritious and longer lasting than anything achieved through single preservation methods. Meat might be partially smoked, then frozen, then packed in rendered fat for long-term storage. This combination provided multiple layers of preservation that ensured food safety while maintaining nutritional value and improving flavor over time. But perhaps most impressive was their development of fermentation techniques that actually increased the nutritional value of foods while making them safe to eat months after preparation. They discovered fermentation processes that transformed tough, fibrous materials into digestible, nutrient-rich foods. Plant materials that would normally be inedible were fermented into foods that provided essential nutrients not available from other sources. Different fermentation techniques produced different results. Some fermentation processes increased vitamin content. Others broke down complex plant materials into simpler compounds that were easier to digest. Some fermentation actually created new nutrients that weren't present in the original ingredients. They even figured out how to ferment animal products in ways that concentrated nutrition while extending storage life. Fish were fermented using techniques that increased protein availability while adding beneficial bacteria that supported digestive health during months when diet diversity was limited. But preserving meat and fish was only part of their food system. They also had to maintain access to plant foods during months when nothing was growing outside. This is where they developed plant preservation techniques that were so advanced they wouldn't be improved upon until the development of modern canning and dehydration technologies. They created controlled drying systems that removed moisture from fruits and vegetables while maintaining vitamin content and nutritional value. This wasn't just laying food out in the sun and hoping for the best. They had figured out the specific conditions needed to dry different types of plant foods optimally. Different plants required different drying techniques. Some foods were dried whole. Others were processed before drying to maximize preservation effectiveness. Some were dried in combination with other materials that enhanced preservation or added nutritional benefits. They built specialized drying structures that controlled airflow, temperature, and humidity to create optimal drying conditions for different types of food. Archaeological evidence shows sophisticated ventilation systems that could maintain consistent drying conditions even during variable weather. But they didn't just preserve plants that were naturally available during harvest seasons. They also developed techniques for growing fresh food during winter months when no plants were growing outside. They figured out how to sprout stored seeds during winter to create fresh vegetables when no plants were growing outside. This wasn't accidental discovery. They had systematically identified which seeds could be sprouted successfully indoors and developed techniques for producing fresh food during the months when it was most needed. Different seeds required different sprouting conditions. Some needed specific temperatures. Others required particular moisture levels. Some had to be treated in specific ways before sprouting to achieve optimal nutrition and growth. They created indoor growing systems that could produce fresh food throughout winter months. These weren't crude experiments. They were sophisticated agricultural systems adapted to work in the challenging conditions of Ice Age winters. Some communities even developed what we might recognize as primitive greenhouses, structures designed to capture and hold solar heat while protecting growing plants from harsh outside conditions. These systems allowed them to extend growing seasons and produce fresh food during months when outdoor agriculture was impossible. The result was winter diets that were actually more diverse and nutritious than what many modern people eat today. Archaeological analysis of human remains from successful Ice Age communities shows evidence of excellent nutrition throughout winter months. These people had strong bones indicating adequate calcium and protein intake. They had good dental health, suggesting diets that weren't heavily loaded with simple carbohydrates. They showed evidence of robust immune systems that could fight off infections and diseases. Most remarkably, they maintained this level of nutrition while dealing with extreme stress, heavy physical activity, and limited food variety that would challenge modern nutritionists trying to design adequate diets. But the most impressive aspect of their food systems wasn't just the preservation and storage techniques. It was how they managed distribution and consumption to ensure that everyone in the community received adequate nutrition throughout the winter months. They developed sharing systems that weren't just about fairness. They were about optimal nutrition management for community survival. Different people received different foods based on their specific nutritional needs and their contributions to community survival. Hunters who expended high amounts of energy tracking game through snow received high-calorie foods that could sustain their activity levels. Pregnant women received foods rich in nutrients needed for fetal development. Children received foods that supported growth and development. Elderly people received foods that were easy to digest and rich in nutrients needed to maintain health during stressful conditions. But this wasn't just individual nutrition management. It was community nutrition optimization that ensured the entire group remained healthy and functional throughout winter months. They had figured out how to balance individual nutritional needs with community food supplies in ways that maximized everyone's health while ensuring that food resources lasted through the entire winter season. This required sophisticated resource management that took into account changing nutritional needs as winter progressed, varying activity levels as conditions changed, and contingency planning for situations where food supplies might run lower than expected. But there was one more aspect of their food systems that was perhaps most remarkable of all. They didn't just use winter months for consuming stored food. They used winter as their primary time for developing new food technologies and improving existing preservation techniques. Because while they were eating the results of last year's innovations, they were busy perfecting the techniques that would make next year's winter even more successful. Your smartphone gives you a 7-day forecast with satellite imagery, radar maps, and hour-by-hour predictions. It's wrong half the time. Ice Age humans could predict weather patterns weeks in advance using nothing but their senses and generations of accumulated knowledge. And they had to be right, because a single miscalculation could mean death for an entire community. In a world where survival depended on perfect timing, when to hunt, when to gather, when to hunker down for incoming storms, our ancestors developed meteorological skills that were so accurate. Some modern meteorologists are studying their methods to improve contemporary weather prediction. But this wasn't just about knowing when the next snowfall would arrive. They could forecast the severity of entire winter seasons based on observations made months earlier. They could read the natural world like a book written in wind patterns, animal behavior, and subtle environmental changes that modern people walk past every day without noticing. This was weather prediction as a matter of life and death. You check your phone to decide whether to bring an umbrella. They read the sky to determine whether their community would live or die during the coming winter. And the accuracy they achieved through pure observation and accumulated wisdom puts many modern forecasting methods to shame. They could sense approaching weather changes days before they arrived by reading subtle shifts that most people would never notice. Changes in air pressure that they felt in their bones. Shifts in wind direction that told them which weather systems were moving toward their area. Variations in cloud formation that indicated the severity and duration of approaching storms. But they didn't just read individual weather events. They understood seasonal patterns at a level that allowed them to predict entire climate cycles. The thickness of animal fur in the fall told them how harsh the winter would be. Animals that had evolved in Ice Age conditions for thousands of years had developed instinctive responses to upcoming weather patterns. Our ancestors learned to read these biological forecasts with extraordinary accuracy. Migration patterns of birds provided information about weather conditions hundreds of miles away. Different bird species migrated in response to different environmental triggers. By observing which birds were leaving when and which birds were arriving from other areas, they could build comprehensive pictures of regional weather patterns that extended far beyond their immediate area. The way certain plants prepared for dormancy gave them information about the timing and duration of winter conditions. Plants had evolved over millennia to respond to subtle environmental cues that predicted seasonal changes. Our ancestors learned to interpret these botanical signals as precisely as modern meteorologists read computer models. Even insect behavior provided crucial forecasting information. The timing of when certain insects disappeared for winter, the depth at which they burrowed, the intensity of their pre-winter activity. All of these were data points in a complex predictive system that could forecast not just when winter would arrive, but how severe it would be and how long it would last. They developed what we might call environmental pattern recognition that went far beyond simple observation. They understood how all of these different natural systems interconnected to create comprehensive pictures of approaching weather conditions. A change in one environmental indicator might suggest one outcome, but when multiple indicators aligned, they could predict weather patterns with remarkable precision. Bird migration timing plus animal fur thickness plus plant dormancy patterns plus insect behavior created a forecasting system that was often more accurate than modern computer models. And based on these predictions, they would adjust everything. A mild winter forecast meant they could take more risks, venture further from shelter during hunting trips, rely more heavily on hunting and less on stored food, allocate more time and resources to tool making and cultural activities rather than pure survival preparation. A severe winter prediction triggered intensive preparation protocols that had been developed and refined over generations. Extra food preservation, additional fuel gathering, reinforcement of shelters, careful rationing calculations that had to be perfect because there would be no second chances. But they didn't just predict general weather patterns. They developed sophisticated understanding of microclimates that allowed them to find pockets of survivable conditions even in the harshest environments. They knew that certain valleys would be protected from the worst winds. Topographical features that created natural windbreaks could mean the difference between areas that were merely cold and areas that were deadly. They understood which hillsides would catch and hold the most sun during brief winter days, creating warming zones that could provide temporary relief during hunting trips or travel. They could identify areas where natural springs would remain unfrozen, even when surface water was solid ice. These unfrozen water sources weren't just important for drinking. They often created microclimates where temperatures were slightly higher and where certain plants might remain available throughout winter months. This knowledge wasn't just practical information. It was life-saving navigation technology. When hunting parties ventured out during winter storms, they used these microclimate maps to find shelter, locate game, and most importantly, find their way back home when visibility was near zero and familiar landmarks were buried under snow. They developed route-finding techniques that took advantage of these microclimate variations. Travel paths that moved from one protected area to another, minimizing exposure to the worst conditions while maximizing access to resources and shelter opportunities. Some of these routes were so precisely planned that they included emergency shelter locations spaced at intervals that matched human endurance limits under specific weather conditions. If a hunting party was caught in an unexpected storm, they knew exactly where to find protection and how far they could travel between safe areas. But perhaps most impressively, they developed what we might call psychological weather forecasting. They understood that the mental challenges of winter were just as dangerous as the physical ones, and they could predict when individual community members or the group as a whole was approaching psychological breaking points. They recognized the signs of what we now call seasonal depression. Changes in behavior, energy levels, and social interaction that indicated someone was struggling with the mental health challenges of winter isolation. And they had intervention strategies that were remarkably sophisticated for people with no formal understanding of psychology. They knew when to organize group activities to boost morale, recognizing when community energy was flagging and implementing specific social activities that provided the mental stimulation and human connection needed to maintain psychological health. They understood when to give people space to avoid conflicts, reading social dynamics carefully enough to identify when interpersonal tensions were building and implementing strategies to diffuse potential conflicts before they could escalate into community-threatening disputes. They even developed what we might recognize as early warning systems for serious psychological crises, signs that indicated when someone was approaching a mental health emergency that could threaten not just their own survival, but the stability of the entire community. Most importantly, they had response protocols for these psychological weather patterns. Just as they had specific preparations for severe weather storms, they had specific interventions for psychological storms that could be just as dangerous to community survival. Special foods that had been saved specifically for psychological emergencies. Certain preserved foods that seemed to have mood-enhancing properties, possibly due to nutritional content that supported brain chemistry during stressful periods. Social activities designed specifically to address different types of psychological challenges. Activities that provided mental stimulation for people struggling with boredom and depression. Social bonding activities for people feeling isolated or disconnected. Creative activities that provided outlets for stress and anxiety. They even developed rotation systems that ensured no one person carried too much responsibility for critical survival tasks for extended periods. Leadership roles, hunting responsibilities, fire tending duties, all of these were rotated regularly to prevent burnout and ensure that essential knowledge and skills were shared among multiple community members. This rotation system served multiple purposes beyond just preventing individual psychological breakdown. It ensured that if someone became ill or incapacitated, there were others who could take over their responsibilities. It provided cross-training that made the entire community more resilient. And it gave everyone variety in their daily activities that helped maintain mental health during long months of limited environmental stimulation. But the most incredible aspect of their weather prediction abilities wasn't any single technique or skill. It was how they integrated all of these different information sources into comprehensive forecasting systems that guided community decision-making at every level. Environmental prediction informed resource allocation decisions. If they predicted a severe winter, they would invest more effort in food preservation and shelter reinforcement. If they predicted mild conditions, they might allocate more time to tool-making and cultural activities. Social management affected community resilience during predicted difficult periods. If they anticipated challenging psychological conditions, they would implement preventive social activities and ensure that support systems were in place before they were needed. Weather prediction influenced hunting and gathering strategies. Understanding seasonal patterns allowed them to optimize their resource acquisition timing, ensuring they gathered necessary supplies before conditions became too harsh, while avoiding premature preparation that would waste energy and resources. But perhaps most remarkably, their forecasting abilities allowed them to plan not just for single seasons, but for multi-year cycles. They understood that some winters were part of longer climate patterns that might last for several years. This long-term thinking allowed them to make decisions that ensured community survival, not just through individual harsh winters, but through extended periods of challenging conditions. This level of environmental prediction and planning required a type of systems thinking that's honestly difficult for modern people to comprehend. They were managing multiple complex variables simultaneously while maintaining flexibility to adapt to changing conditions and unexpected developments. And the results of this sophisticated environmental management were about to transform not just their own survival, but the entire future of human civilization. In the modern world, when stress gets high, people fall apart. Relationships crumble, communities fragment. Cooperation breaks down just when it's needed most. Ice Age communities faced stress that would destroy most modern societies in days. Yet under these impossible conditions, they developed forms of cooperation and social organization that were so advanced they challenge our basic assumptions about human nature. This wasn't just people helping each other when convenient. This was social engineering at a level that created communities where individual survival became literally impossible without group success, where personal identity merged with community identity in ways that transformed ordinary humans into something approaching a collective organism. and the archaeological evidence shows us exactly how they did it. You live in a world where you can survive alone if necessary. You can buy food without hunting, find shelter without building it, stay warm without depending on others. Ice Age communities existed in conditions where individual survival was physically impossible. No one person could hunt enough food, gather enough fuel, build adequate shelter, or maintain fire continuously throughout winter months. This absolute dependence on community cooperation could have created competition, conflict, and social breakdown. Instead, it became the foundation for levels of human cooperation that we rarely see today. They didn't just cooperate out of necessity. They engineered cooperation systems that made communities stronger and more capable than the sum of their individual parts. At sites like Dolní Věstonice in what is now the Czech Republic, archaeologists have found evidence of communities that lived through winter months so harsh that survival should have been impossible. Temperatures that regularly hit -50 degrees Fahrenheit, winds that could freeze exposed skin in minutes, snow depths that made travel impossible for weeks at a time. Yet these communities didn't just survive, they thrived. And the evidence shows us exactly how they achieved something that seems almost miraculous when you understand the conditions they faced. They created social structures where every person's survival depended on every other person's success. Not just in obvious ways like sharing food or maintaining fire, but in complex, interconnected ways that made community cooperation automatic rather than voluntary. No one person possessed all the knowledge needed for survival. Hunting skills were distributed among multiple community members. Food preservation knowledge was shared by several specialists. Shelter construction required expertise from different people with different skills. Tool making involved multiple specialists who each contributed essential knowledge to the final product. This distribution of essential knowledge meant that losing any community member was a serious threat to everyone's survival. But it also meant that everyone had skills and knowledge that were valued and necessary. Everyone had a role that mattered. Everyone had contributions that were essential to community success. This created what psychologists would recognize as optimal conditions for human cooperation. When individual success is impossible without group success, when everyone's contributions are valued, when everyone has a meaningful role in collective survival, human beings naturally develop extraordinary levels of mutual support and cooperation. But they didn't just rely on natural cooperation. They engineered social systems that reinforced and strengthened cooperative behavior. They developed leadership structures that prevented the kind of power struggles that destroy communities under stress. Rather than single leaders who made all decisions, they created distributed leadership systems where different people led different aspects of community life. Weather prediction might be led by one person with particular expertise in environmental observation. Food management might be coordinated by someone else with specialized knowledge of preservation techniques. Social coordination might be handled by a person with particular skills in conflict resolution and group dynamics. These leadership roles weren't permanent positions that created lasting power imbalances. They were functional responsibilities that could shift based on changing circumstances, individual expertise, and community needs. This prevented the formation of rigid hierarchies that could become sources of conflict during stressful periods. Decision-making processes were designed to ensure that everyone felt heard and valued, while still allowing for efficient action when quick decisions were necessary. They developed what we might recognize as sophisticated consensus-building techniques that could achieve group agreement without the endless debates that can paralyze modern committees. For routine decisions, they had established protocols that allowed quick action based on previously agreed principles. For major decisions that affected the entire community, they had discussion processes that ensured everyone understood the options and supported the final choice. Most importantly, they had conflict resolution systems that addressed problems before they could escalate into community-threatening disputes. They understood that in conditions where community breakdown meant death, preventing conflicts was far more important than winning arguments. They developed what we might call early intervention techniques for social problems, signs that indicated when interpersonal tensions were building, methods for addressing misunderstandings before they became serious conflicts, ways of redirecting competitive impulses into productive activities that benefited the entire community. When conflicts did arise, they had resolution processes that focused on rebuilding community harmony rather than determining who was right or wrong. The goal wasn't punishment or blame. It was restoring the cooperation that everyone's survival depended on. But perhaps most remarkably, they created resource-sharing systems that went far beyond simple fairness or equal distribution. They developed sophisticated understanding of how to allocate resources in ways that optimized everyone's survival and contribution capacity. People with high-energy roles received high-calorie foods that could sustain their activity levels. But this wasn't just about individual needs. It was about optimizing community capability. Keeping hunters healthy and effective meant better food acquisition for everyone. Maintaining craftspeople's energy levels meant better tools and equipment for the entire community. Resource allocation took into account not just immediate needs, but long-term community capacity. Pregnant women received foods rich in nutrients needed for fetal development because healthy children were essential for community continuity. Elderly people received foods that supported their health and cognitive function because their knowledge and experience were crucial for community success. They even developed what we might recognize as social insurance systems. When someone became ill or injured, the community had protocols for redistributing their responsibilities and ensuring their care without creating unsustainable burdens on other community members. These systems weren't just emergency responses, they were planned aspects of community organization that ensured individual crises didn't become community disasters. But the most sophisticated aspect of their social engineering was how they handled the psychological challenges of close-quarter living during months of extreme stress. Modern people get cabin fever after a few days of bad weather. Ice Age communities had to live in close proximity for months while dealing with life-threatening conditions that created constant stress and anxiety. They created social systems that not only prevented the conflicts that could destroy communities under these conditions, but actually used shared hardship as an opportunity to create stronger social bonds. They developed rituals and customs that reinforced community identity and individual belonging. These weren't just random traditions. They were carefully designed social technologies that addressed specific psychological needs that arose during winter isolation. Storytelling sessions that weren't just entertainment, but community bonding activities that reinforced shared values and collective identity. Work activities that required cooperation and coordination, creating opportunities for positive social interaction and mutual accomplishment. Sharing rituals that went beyond simple resource distribution. Ceremonies that emphasized interdependence and mutual support, reinforcing the social bonds that made cooperation natural rather than forced. They even created privacy systems within their shared living spaces that allowed for individual retreat and personal space when people needed psychological relief from constant social interaction. These weren't luxury accommodations. They were essential mental health features that prevented the social breakdown that could kill communities under stress. The result was communities that didn't just tolerate close-quarter living during harsh conditions. They used those conditions to forge social bonds that were stronger than anything most modern communities ever achieve. Archaeological evidence suggests that successful Ice Age communities developed what we might call super-social bonds that went far beyond normal friendship or family relationships. These were connections where individual identity became inseparable from community identity in ways that created extraordinary levels of mutual support and cooperation. People didn't just help each other when it was convenient or when they felt like it. Mutual support became as automatic as breathing because individual welfare and community welfare had become psychologically inseparable. This transformation didn't happen accidentally. It was the result of social systems designed to break down the psychological barriers that normally keep people separate while strengthening the bonds that made communities resilient. But there was one more aspect of their social organization that was perhaps most crucial of all. They didn't just create cooperative communities. They created learning communities where knowledge and innovation could flourish, even under the most challenging conditions. And that's where they discovered something that would change the trajectory of human civilization forever. But what happened when communities failed? The wind over the steppe carried more than the scent of snow. It carried whispers, messages traveling farther than the eye could see. Long before maps were drawn, people learned that survival meant more than knowing the land. It meant knowing each other. Across the Ice Age world, no village stood alone. Even the most isolated campfire was part of an invisible web stretching hundreds of miles. Hunters from one valley might carry obsidian blades from a volcano far to the south. Dried fish might change hands 3 times before reaching a settlement that had never seen the river it came from. This was not chance. It was design. They built networks of survival, agreements, friendships, and unspoken rules that bound strangers together. In hard years, a tribe with too little food could count on a neighboring group to share what they had, knowing that one day the debt would be repaid. These bonds were insurance policies against famine, against drought, against the kind of bad luck that could wipe out a family in weeks. But it wasn't just about trade goods. It was about information. A migrating herd sighted on the plains, the warning sign of a disease in another camp, the location of a safe crossing over a dangerous river. In an age before writing, every word had to be carried on the breath of another human being. People became living archives, and when trouble came, a storm that buried the land in ice, an enemy raid, a river that flooded its banks, the network tightened. Messages traveled swiftly, hands reached out, food and tools moved across the land like lifelines. But the network had a weak point. It depended on trust. When a promise was broken, when help didn't arrive, when one link failed, the chain could snap. And in the cold, a broken chain could be a death sentence. But what happened when communities failed? That's where our story turns next. The secret wasn't in their tools, it was in their minds. Somewhere in the frozen north, archaeologists once uncovered the remains of a settlement that had been home to dozens of people. It sat on a rise above a river, well positioned for fishing and hunting. Its people had shelter, tools, even art carved from bone. And yet, they were gone. Layer by layer, the soil revealed a story. Broken pottery, scattered bones, half-finished tools. The signs of struggle were faint but clear. They had not been conquered. They had not simply moved away. They had vanished, leaving only the silence of failure. Why? In some cases, the answer was simple. Climate. A winter too long, a summer too short. In others, it was disease, or a hunting ground that suddenly ran empty. But often, the difference between survival and collapse wasn't in the strength of their walls or the sharpness of their blades. It was in their minds. Under pressure, communities could fracture. Arguments over resources, distrust between families, leaders making desperate, dangerous choices. In the cold and dark, the human mind could turn inward, towards fear, towards suspicion, towards hopelessness. Once trust was gone, cooperation followed, and without cooperation, survival was almost impossible. Archaeological records tell us that some communities, facing the same disasters, adapted. They packed their belongings and joined others. They split into smaller, more mobile groups. They changed their diet. They endured. Others simply could not make the leap. And so the ruins tell two stories. One is about the cruelty of nature. The other is about the resilience, or fragility, of the human spirit. The secret wasn't in their tools. It was in their minds. Those who could adapt, trust, and hold together when the cold pressed hardest, they were the ones who survived. They built something humanity has been trying to recreate ever since. Survival was never just about food and fire. It was about belonging. In the harshest climates, people became more than individuals. They became parts of something greater, a living, breathing organism made up of many human hearts. The strongest survival tool they had was each other. Super social bonds formed in small Ice Age groups. People didn't just know each other's names. They knew each other's stories, fears, and dreams. The child who lost her parents wasn't left alone. She was raised by the group. The elder who could no longer hunt still had value as a storyteller, a teacher, a keeper of memory. Rituals bound them even closer. Around the fire, songs told of ancestors. Dances marked the seasons. Shared meals were more than nourishment. They were ceremonies of unity. These weren't luxuries. They were lifelines for the mind. In the crushing dark of winter, rituals reminded people why they must keep going. And when tragedy struck, when a hunt failed, when sickness took someone too soon, they did not carry the weight alone. They mourned together. They remembered together. They adapted together. Archaeologists find the traces of this in graves carefully prepared, in shared shelters that grew larger over time, in artifacts clearly meant for group ceremonies rather than personal use. Even in death, they stayed together. They built something humanity has been trying to recreate ever since. Our cities, our nations, even our online communities, all are echoes of the small, tightly bound circles that once kept our ancestors alive. The fire they lit still burns, but do we know how to tend it? Then, one day, the ice began to retreat. The great cold loosened its grip, and with it came change. Rivers ran free again. Grasslands opened. Game became easier to find. Life, for the first time in generations, was less about sheer survival and more about comfort. And slowly, almost without noticing, people began to forget. They forgot the old routes that had once connected distant camps. They forgot how to read the signs in the wind that warned of storms. The skills that once meant life or death, tracking, preserving food for months, making shelter from nothing, became less urgent, then optional, then rare. Technologies vanished. Tools for hunting in deep snow, for fishing through thick ice, for storing meat in frozen ground, abandoned because they were no longer needed. Even the languages shifted, losing the words for things that no longer existed. It is a strange truth of history. Easier times can erode the very strengths that once carried us through the hardest. The fire they lit, the knowledge, the discipline, the bonds, still burns in us, faintly. But do we know how to tend it? If the world turned cold again, if comfort fell away, could we remember fast enough to survive? As the ice withdrew, our ancestors stepped into a new world. But in doing so, they closed the door on another, one filled with lessons we may one day wish we had kept.